Today we're continuing with epithelial tissue and chapter 4. And so we left off talking about pseudostratified ciliated columnar epithelium, and that of course is found mostly in the upper respiratory tract. It has that cilia there to kind of capture any dirt and debris that comes in. Now we're going to start talking about how stuff gets across simple epithelia. So remember, when we're talking about epithelial cells, specifically simple squamous epithelial cells, right? They're one cell layer thick. And now remember, substances, for the most part, cannot pass through the gaps between them. Most of the time, substances have to pass through the cell membrane, through the cell, and then out the other cell membrane, right, on the other side, to get to where they have to go. So if this is like the air sac of the lungs, right, and this is maybe the blood, right, because that's what the lungs do. They get the gas out of the air and put it in the blood, so we'll just kind of simplify it like this. It's going to happen in two ways, right? We have pericellular transport and transcellular transport. Pericellular transport is when the substances are leaking between the cells. This happens in a very limited number of cases because, of course, our epithelial cells are linked together very tightly, and they're almost designed to not let this happen. There are some cases where this happens. So this is called pericellular. So if you kind of drew this with me, then maybe you'd want to label that, right? And transcellular is where it's passing through. It's literally passing from one side of the cell membrane through the cell, kind of like coming in the front door of the house, going through the house, and then going out the back door, right? As opposed to just going in between the houses, so to speak. And so you have pericellular, transcellular. That prefix there, trans, should make you think of like a transverse section, something cutting through or passing through. And so transcellular, passing through the cell. This is how the majority of substances will move across simple epithelia. They will move through transcellular. This is just a nice diagram. Probably makes a lot more sense than the one I just drew on the board. In case you can't understand what I drew, or in case you look back at your notes and you're like, I have no idea what I drew, it's right here on this slide, explaining para versus trans. So, moving on, and let's talk about stratified epithelium. If I recall, did we start like a big graphic organizer?
Yeah.
Yeah, all right, so we're going to add on to that. Off of epithelia, we probably had a branch that said simple, and then we had all of the simple squamous, simple columnar, simple cuboidal. Well, now we're going to go to stratified, right? So you can go back to that same graphic organizer if you like, and we're going to keep adding on to it. Right? And so we had simple, and this is all of the same things that we drew before, right? But now we're going to talk about stratified. And so stratified epithelium is one that has more than one cell layer. There is a type of stratified squamous that's called keratinized stratified squamous epithelium. So this keratinized stratified, it's a mouthful, squamous. This is our skin. That's what it is. It's our skin. We use the term keratinized to describe the protein that is filling these cells. It's called keratin. So the stratified squamous cells that make up our skin is filled with a protein called keratin. Keratin is what kind of causes our skin to dry out. Does anyone remember what type of tissue we have lining the inside of our mouth and esophagus? No, it's actually stratified squamous. Yeah, it's still stratified squamous. Anywhere where there's friction, stuff passing over, you're going to have stratified squamous. But think about how the inside of your cheek is different from the outside of your cheek. Right? It's kind of soft and pink and moist in there, as opposed to the outside, which is kind of dry and rough. That's the difference keratin makes. Keratin turns these cells into little crusty flakes, whereas when they just grow up and get pushed up through the layers, they kind of stay lubricated and puffy a little bit. So keratin is what makes our skin, this is the non-keratinized. Keratin is what makes our skin very, very dry. So non-keratinized stratified squamous. This is like the inside of our cheeks, inside of esophagus. This is all lining areas on the inside of our body that are subject to friction. And so these cells aren't quite as dried out as the cells making up our skin. Okay. Make sure I didn't skip something. This board was acting a little crazy earlier today again. There we go. So stratified cuboidal is very rare. It's not a common occurrence. And you just have to know what the word means. You don't have to know where it is because it's only in certain sweat glands. So don't even bother with it. But because you know what the term stratified means and the term cuboidal, you understand what the term stratified cuboidal is. You don't have, I'm not going to ask you a question that says, where in the body would you find stratified cuboidal? Because it's so rare. Just like stratified columnar, super rare. You know what the word stratified means, you know what columnar means, but I'm not going to ask you a question that says, where in the body is stratified columnar? There's only a few instances in the body. It's not very common at all. There is another type of epithelia that isn't quite, it is considered stratified, but it's not quite cuboidal and it's not quite squamous. We mentioned it last night in lab. It's called transitional. Transitional epithelium changes from squamous to cuboidal, right? And it's found in the urinary bladder. And it's called transitional because it changes shape. So this was the one I said when we were looking at it in lab. I said, well, this is the one where you're not really going to be able to tell what shape the cells are, so just go with transitional. They kind of puff up when the bladder's empty, and then when the bladder's full, they squish to the sides. And then the bladder fills, the bladder empties again. They can kind of puff up and loosen the belt, so to speak, and then they get squished again as your bladder fills. So that's transitional epithelium. So this is a nice chart that's directly from your book that goes through the different cell types. So again, if making a graphic organizer like this blows your mind and you can't make any sense of it and it's confusing and you don't remember what you wrote, you can always go back to your book because that's where all this information comes from. I try to keep my lectures right in line with your textbook because you paid a lot of money for it. And so I want to make sure that you're using it and getting that value out of it. So all of the same stuff that we went through and drew all over the board is here as well. So it's simple. This is stratified. Again, I'm omitting stratified columnar and stratified cuboidal just because they're so rare. It's not worth trying to squeeze those facts into our brains. Let's focus on the ones that are more common. So let's go ahead and put. Yep, this is what I was doing earlier. Really strange. There we go. So the other thing that kind of goes along with epithelial tissue is glands. So I'm going to erase I'm just going to do it over here. It's okay. And then eventually I'll have to erase all of this because the whole graphic organizer is not going to fit. But that's okay. There are two types of glands in our body. There are exocrine glands and there are endocrine glands. That word endocrine should sound familiar, right? What do you think of when you hear an endocrine gland? You think of the endocrine system, right? And so what do we know about the endocrine system? When you think endocrine system, you're probably thinking hormones, right? And so the endocrine glands in your body are made of epithelial tissue, and these secrete hormones into the surrounding fluid. They just kind of sweat the hormone out into whatever solution or whatever body cavity they're sitting in, right? So endocrine organs use, scratch that, they secrete hormones into the surrounding fluid. right? So they just kind of ooze whatever hormone, right? Thyroid hormone just kind of oozes from the thyroid gland into the surrounding cavity. Exocrine glands do something else. What other type of gland do you have in your body? Sweat gland. It would be an example of an exocrine gland. So think of how is an exocrine gland, like a sweat gland, different from something like your thyroid gland?
One secretes into the body, one's out.
Yeah, one's secreting onto a surface, right? And it's secreting onto a surface through a duct. It's using a duct. And we will see this when we look at skin structure in the next chapter, that these exocrine glands, like our sweat glands and our oil glands and our earwax glands and our mammary glands, they all secrete using a little duct. So a duct or a tube, right? Not like duck, like quack quack, but a duct like a tube, right? So they secrete into a tube onto a surface, right? And in this case, it's usually not a hormone. It's a secretion. It's something that the cell has made. So I kind of lectured on this already, but we'll flip through the slide. So endocrine glands secrete hormones into the bloodstream or into the surrounding fluid, wherever they happen to be. And the effects of our endocrine glands and our endocrine hormones are widespread effects because it's going into the blood. So it can have a body-wide effect. And we'll look at that at the end of this semester when we do the endocrine system. Whereas exocrine glands are just secreting onto the surface. So this isn't entering the blood. It's not going to change your entire body chemistry. It's just affecting that one little area that was secreted onto. So some of these exocrine glands are just one cell big, and some of them are multicellular and complex. So a goblet cell would be an example of a unicellular exocrine gland. A goblet cell secretes mucus into the respiratory tract and digestive tract. So you probably noticed these yesterday in lab when we were looking at the simple columnar epithelium. You saw a bunch of columnar cells, and then every once in a while, one of these big white blobs there. Those big white blobs are goblet cells. So these are another giveaway that what you're looking at is simple columnar, because you're going to see these white bubbles in there. And you're like, hey, I don't know what that is. It's a goblet cell secreting mucus, right? The mucus is going to help push that food through your digestive tract, help catch dirt and debris in your respiratory tract. So some of the ducts that these glands secrete onto are simple, and some of them are compound. Simple ducts are just one little tube dipping down. So an example, and I'm sure there's pictures on the next slide, but if this is our skin surface, and this is, say, a sweat gland, this would be an example of a simple duct, right? It just goes right down. Whereas a compound, this would come down and kind of go this way, and maybe a little this way, and this way, right? It has all of these different pathways in it. That's the difference between a compound and a simple, right? There's also different shapes. So they can be tubular, they can be a cinar shaped, or just kind of spherical or bubble shaped, or they can be a combination of both. Right? So what I drew over here was kind of tubular in appearance, right? And a cinar would be more like this, where it comes out and it forms like a bubble, right? More of a bubble instead of a tube. And there's pictures. There they are. Much better to look at than my little crappy drawings, right? So these are all different classifications of exocrine glands in your body. They're classified by how branched or unbranched, right? Simple or compound, and then by the shape of those cells that are secreting. So are they bubble shaped, are they shaped in like a tube, or are they a combination of both, right? So simple tubular versus simple acinar versus compound acinar versus compound tubular acinar, which is, it's lots of branches and, you know, the tubes and the little pockets. So, but notice they all form a duct. So, there are different ways that these substances secrete. So, They're classified by their tube shape and their pocket size. And you can add that on here, how they're classified. I'm just going to write classified by, and then you can always go back and fill that in. But they secrete in different ways. They have 3 modes of secretion. So in other words, how does the stuff get outside of those secreting cells? One of those ways is called merocrine secretion. In merocrine secretion, this is, again, the majority of our exocrine glands. This is a very watery secretion, and this is where the secretion just goes into little vesicles packaged by the Golgi, right? It just gets pushed out of the cell. So vesicles just gather up the sweat, push it outside of the cell. So it's secreted using vesicles. That's what merocrine secretion does. I apologize, I'm at the bottom of the board over here. Merocrine secretion just uses, I'm going to write the word vesicles because that's the technical term. I was going to write bubbles, but vesicles are bubbles, right? The other way is something called holocrine secretion. Holocrine secretion is where the entire cell bursts. Look what's going on here, right? I'll flip back. In merocrine secretion, we have little bubbles going, oh, there you go, I zoomed in on purpose. Little bubbles secreting into that little duct to go up, and that's our sweat, right? In holocrine secretion, right? Holocrine secretion, here we have the individual cells bursting. The cells are kind of committing cell suicide. When I think of holocrine secretion, I think of the Holocaust, right? Lots of death and destruction, right? That's what these cells are doing. They're dying, they're being destroyed, right? To let whatever was produced inside of them be released. So that's what our holocrine form of secretion is. Sebum, or oil, the oil that's on our skin, the oil that's on our face, the oil that's in our hair, is secreted in this way. Think about how oil differs than sweat, right? Sweat is kind of watery. This is more mucousy, right? And that's partly because of the different mode of secretion. So holocrine secretion, the cell explodes. The other form of secretion is called apocrine. Apocrine is like when parts of the cell are broken off. So I think of it almost as like eating cotton candy. You like pull a piece of the cotton candy off and you eat it. That's kind of what's happening in apocrine secretion. Just a little piece of the cell is coming off. The whole cell is still there, but you're just pulling little pieces off, and that's what's being secreted. Or you can think of it as taking a bite of an apple, apocrine secretion, apple, right? And that's how this substance is secreted. So it's parts of the cell coming off to release the substance, whatever that substance is. In some cases, it's milk. Mammary glands secrete in this way. Some of our sweat glands secrete in this way. Think about this. Are all the sweat glands in your body the same? In other words, the sweat that comes on your forehead, is that the same type of sweat that's in your armpits? No. No. You know that, right? You sweat on your forehead, you're not going to start stinking. You start sweating your armpits, you're going to need some deodorant, right? It gets stinky. It's because our armpits secrete in this apocrine form of secretion, whereas like our forehead secretes in that merocrine form of secretion. So they have different components, right, which produces these different types of solutions coming out of our body. So epithelial covers all of our body surfaces, and so because it's there for protection, it's going to get exposed to many different carcinogens. A carcinogen is something that causes a change in your DNA. You're probably familiar with carcinogens like UV light, right? We know that you're not supposed to go out in the sun and get sunburned. Well, UV light can cause an actual DNA change in our epithelial cells that leads to something called a carcinoma. Right? A carcinoma is an epithelial cancer, right? And there's actually other types of carcinomas that can happen in your lungs and all over your body. But you know, in terms of epithelia, we're focusing on anywhere that's a covering or a lining. So anywhere where there's epithelial tissue, it's subject to mutation from whatever it's exposed to, whether it's light or some type of bacterial infection or whatever, could possibly lead to cancer called carcinoma. So examples of carcinomas: basal cell carcinoma. This one is no skin cancer is good, but if any skin cancer was the good kind, it would be this kind. This is just the typical, you go into the dermatologist in an outpatient procedure, they just kind of zip that little spot off of you. It's where the basement membrane is on the epithelial cells within your skin, and that part is what becomes mutated, which changes the skin surface. And so carcinomas are fairly common, unfortunately, and the majority of them result from a lifetime of sun exposure, particularly if you get sunburn at a young age. So if you think back to maybe 15 and under, 20 and under, did you get sunburn a lot? If you did, then you're really susceptible to developing this basal cell carcinoma later in life, meaning in your 50s and 60s, right? So you might have not taken good care of your skin back in the day, but now you're taking really good care of it. It doesn't matter. Those long-term effects can build up. So we're going to switch gears from epithelia and start talking about connective tissue. Remember I said the bulk of this chapter is epithelia and connective. Muscle and nervous tissue we'll talk about a little bit, but really the major component here is connective tissue. So we're going to continue on with, and if you have the big graphic organizer that we started last class and you have lots of room on it, about half of it left, you can continue on. Otherwise we'll just start a new one and we'll just call it connective tissue, because you're going to want to include lots of details on it. And I'll leave that up for right now because I think we'll be able to use this side for all of this. So, there we go, connective tissue. There's two main types of connective tissue. There's specialized connective tissue and then what we call connective tissue proper. So connective tissue, remember, has different types of cells in it and that extracellular matrix which has ground substance and fibers. So it's a totally different type of beast, so to speak. It's good for connecting and binding. It's good for support. It's good for protection. It also helps transport. So lots of factors here in connective tissue. It connects things, which is the obvious answer, right? It is going to provide support for our body in the form of bones and cartilage, right? It's also there for protection. Bones and cartilage help protect, and so does fat tissue. Fat tissue is also a connective tissue, and it transports. Lymph and blood are both forms of connective tissue. Oops. Swear I'm not an idiot. Okay. So the cells have those protein fibers and a ground substance, and we're going to talk more specifically about those cells and that ground substance kind of as we go. Let's talk about general connective tissue first. This is the type of tissue that's found throughout the body. It's widespread, it's connecting organs to one another, and it's going to actually serve as a framework for scaffolding for particular organs in our body, and we'll look at those kind of as we go. Let's first talk about the cells of connective tissue proper. So we have connective tissue proper. And let's just talk about the cells of it first. And I'm actually going to draw this part over here because there's just not enough room there for me to squeeze it all in. They're listed right there for you. These cells are fibroblasts. Fibroblasts secrete fibers. These are the ones that I think of as little Spider-Man. They're like, go web, like the little stuff like shoots out, like that's what these fibroblasts do. They're secreting fibers, collagen, elastic, and reticular fibers. Doesn't matter what type of fiber it is, the fibroblast can make it, okay? Fibroblasts are similar to, and it's not on your PowerPoint, but it's another one you should be familiar with, it's fibrocyte. A fibrocyte, this maintains the fibers. right? So it's going to help repair fibers if they start breaking. A fibrocyte helps to maintain the fibers. A fibroblast secretes the fibers. Another type of cell we're going to see in connective tissue proper is adipocytes. Adipocytes are fat cells. Right? These store energy. That's their main function. We also have mast cells. We've heard of those before. We mentioned those in lab last night. What do mast cells do? Does anyone remember?
They grow
They don't grow anything. What do they do?
immunity.
It's kind of related to immunity.
I said
They are inflammation.
Yeah, they bring about the inflammatory response. They're going to be activated when there's some type of injury. They're going to bring about and induce the inflammatory response. So mast cells release, do you remember the names? Histamine and?
Pepper.
Yeah. Histamine and heparin for the inflammatory response. So these are immune system cells that are within our connective tissue. We also have phagocytes. An example of a phagocyte would be something called a macrophage. These are, well, we'll stick with like comics and a game theme. These are like Pac-Man. They go around and they eat things that don't belong. They gobble them up. That's what a phagocyte does. Phagocyte is literally translates to cell eater, is what it is. It goes by and parts of cells that don't belong there, dead bacteria that don't belong there, old fibers that are worn out and aren't being maintained, the phagocytes eat them. So macrophage is like Pac-Man. And then there's other immune system cells in there, and we'll be introduced to them kind of as we go. There's lymphocytes, which make our antibodies. There's dendritic cells, which are also going to work alongside mast cells. So there's a couple other types of cells that are involved there. But those are the main types of cells that we're going to see in our connective tissue proper. And these slides, of course, go through and summarize all the same things that I just said. Fibroblasts, most common. These guys are the ones that are making the protein, secreting the ground substance, laying down the fibers, right, for this connective tissue. Adipocytes are our fat cells, storing that fat bubble. Adipocytes actually stop dividing after the age of like 5. You don't make any more fat cells. So the fat cells that you have today, you might have technically more fat on your body than you did when you were 5. That's just because they get bigger. The fat cells just get bigger and bigger and bigger as opposed to them dividing, right? So, and then of course when you lose weight or use more energy than you put into your body, the fat cells shrink, literally. So, mast cells, as we mentioned, mast cells are cells that release histamine and heparin to bring about that immune system response, that inflammatory response to help protect the area, increase blood flow and all that stuff to prevent infection. Phagocytes are there. Other immune system cells, you know, I was just thinking, there's one important one that was left off, and I'm going to mention it because it is important to understand. And these are called mesenchymal cells. Has anyone ever heard that word before? M-E-S-E-N-C-H-Y-M-A-L. Mesenchymal. M-E-S-E-N-C-H-Y-M-A-L. Mesenchymal cells. Mesenchymal cells are stem cells. They're a type of stem cell that can turn into any of these things when they need to. So it's a stem cell that can turn into a fibroblast or a stem cell that can turn into an adipocyte. So let's say, for example, you go and you have liposuction and you get all the fat cells removed from your abdominal area. But you continue to live a sedentary lifestyle and eat cheeseburgers and french fries and drink a lot of beer and blah, 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 right? So how do you get fat? Eventually, if you don't have any fat cells there, fat cells can't divide, it's because you have mesenchymal cells there that can turn into fat cells. So mesenchymal cells can create new fat cells. They can create new fibroblasts if the tissue is damaged. So you get burned, right? And it burns all the way through your dermis and through those connective tissue layers, right? And it forms lots and lots of scar tissue. But eventually, some of your hair and some of your nerve endings and all of those things might come back because mesenchymal cells will start differentiating into these different things that give you those properties of the connective tissue that you originally had. So mesenchymal cells are pretty important to understand about. You can't quite turn them into anything yet, but there is some research that's taking these types of stem cells and turning them into like a heart or like a nerve ending or something, you know, to return function. It's pretty cool research. So let's go back to our little guy over there and continue on talking about the types of connective tissue proper. There is dense, there's loose, there's reticular, and there's adipose. So we'll go through these. Loose connective tissue. Loose connective tissue. This is like the irregular connective tissue that we looked at last night. There's lots of ground substance and few fibers and cells. Lots of matrix. Well, I'll say lots of ground substance, it's more specific. Lots of ground substance, meaning lots of the fluid component, few fibers, few cells. Irregular connective tissue is found beneath the skin. It's also found lining some membranes. It's the ultimate packing material in our body. The chances are, if you are looking at connective tissue on a dissection or in a specimen, the chances of it being irregular connective tissue are pretty good. Basically, anywhere where your body says, we have this extra space here, and somehow we need to connect the spleen to this wall of the stomach, let's go ahead and stick some irregular connective tissue in there. Right? Irregular fills all of the gaps and the spaces. It's a pretty good space filler. So that's what irregular tissue looks like. We were able to see that in lab. Lots of fibers, so there's elastic and collagen fibers. The cells that you see are mostly fibroblasts, and they're maintaining the fibers in irregular tissue.
I thought it has few fibers.
Compared to what we're going to look at when we see dense, this is few. Yeah. So dense connective tissue. Another type of, I want to add adipose tissue here because it is a type of loose connective tissue. Adipose tissue is a type of loose connective tissue. And this, of course, is dominated by adipocytes, those fat cells. Right, it's our fat cells. In terms of dense connective tissue, we have dense regular and dense irregular. So I'm going to abbreviate dense irregular with DICT. Bless you. This is dense irregular connective tissue, DICT. Dense irregular connective tissue. This is the one, when we looked at it in lab, I said kind of looked like chopped up ground beef. Right? If you have that nice pink ground beef in the package and then you put it in the pan and start chopping it up to make tacos, kind of this, some of the fibers are going this way, some of them are going this way, some of them are going that way. They're going in all different directions. And it's primarily collagen fibers. So it's densely packed collagen fibers. And this is found in the dermis of our skin. You'll see where that is and what it does in the next chapter. But this is one of the reasons why, if you pull your skin up, it only goes so far. Because you have dense irregular connective tissue there, which has lots of collagen, which resists tension, holding that skin down and keeping it in place. So there's dense irregular connective tissue. Fibers going in all different directions. You'll see a sprinkling of cells in there. Those cells are fibroblasts, but mostly what you're going to see are those pink wavy lines, which are the collagen fibers. Dense regular connective tissue, DRCT. right? Dense regular connective tissue. This is, again, primarily dominated by collagen fibers, except here the fibers are arranged together in bands, right? So it's going to look more like a rope instead of like all of this randomness. Or, to go back to my ground beef analogy, it's the ground beef in the packaging. All those little wavy pieces of meat are going in the same direction. So again, it's collagen fibers that dominate it. And dense regular connective tissue, this is our tendons and ligaments, right? This is connecting bone to bone and muscle to bone. So this is a more organized, parallel fashion to organize the collagen as opposed to very irregular and sporadic, right? So you'll see a sprinkling of cells in there, and you can always tell they're cells because they're just little dark stained nuclei, right? And then a bunch of pink lines. That's the collagen. It's tightly packed together. Okay, elastic tissue is another form of dense tissue. Elastic tissue is dominated by elastic fibers. I'm not going to write that. I'm just going to write elastic fibers. Dominated by elastic fibers as opposed to collagen fibers. So these are in areas that have to stretch in order to function, areas that have to kind of have some type of resiliency to bounce back. Areas like our aorta, which are under extreme pressure sometimes, and then they can relax. Expand and relax. Expand and relax. Bless you. And so that aorta, the elastic walls of the aorta and the elastic walls of some of our arteries can really expand and contract because of that elastic tissue in there. Those elastic fibers are what allow the skin to bounce back or allow the blood vessels to bounce back. So elastic fibers are much more springy looking. This, I don't think this was one that you had to look at yesterday under the microscope. So, going back to our structure function concept that we keep kind of hounding on, right? Something that needs to resist force in multiple directions will have collagen that goes in different directions, like our dense, irregular connective tissue. Think about how our skin can twist and bend and gets pulled all the time. It's a great area for dense, irregular connective tissue. Whereas dense, regular connective tissue, those fibers are all going in the same direction. So you pull a little this way, it's not going to do much. You pull a little this way, it's not going to do much. These make great connectors, right? Which is why that's what our tendons and ligaments are made of. And then we get to elastic tissue, which has a lot of spring and resiliency and can boing and bounce back, right? So it's good for areas that need to expand and contract quickly, kind of come back to shape with that springing action. So that's what those elastic fibers help elastic tissue to do. Other types of connective tissue. Other than loose and dense, we have reticular tissue, which is dominated by reticular fibers. Right, we have three types of fibers: collagen, elastic, and reticular. So reticular tissue is surrounding organs like our spleen and our lymph nodes. It surrounds the spleen, lymph nodes, parts of our liver, parts of our lungs. These organs are actually called reticular organs because they have a dominant presence of reticular tissue. The reticular tissue, oops, I wrote it on the wrong one. The reticular tissue surrounds spleen and lymph nodes. Sorry about that. The reticular tissue provides like a scaffolding or a framework. Imagine like a spider web, a cobweb wrapped around these organs, holding all of those cells in place, keeping them connected. So that's what it does. See how all of these cells, in this case they're white blood cells of our lymph node here, they're all kind of attached to those reticular fibers. So the reticular fibers act as like a spider web, catching those cells and keeping them in place, holding the lymph node together. I just did that. Okay. Adipose tissue, I mentioned adipose already. It is a type of loose connective tissue, although your book doesn't quite classified as that. It's for storage and insulation, shock absorption, surrounds and protects organs like our kidneys. Your kidneys are in your back. They don't have a lot of bony protection because they're below your rib cage, so they're surrounded by fat. That's the only protection your kidneys have. There's that adipose tissue. Adipose tissue actually comes in two varieties. It can be white or brown. White fat is the fat that you have. White fat is the fat we try to lose. White fat is those cells that get very, very large. This is the visceral fat that surrounds our organs, right? This is the fat that accumulates on us when we eat too much. Brown fat is less common. When you're born, when babies are born, they have a large percentage of brown fat on their body. Brown fat is easily accessible by the bloodstream. It's quickly metabolized. So think about it. When babies are born, they cry a lot, they eat a lot, but they also can't eat too much because their stomachs are so small. Their stomachs are like the size of your thumbnail, right, when they're born. So they fill up really quickly. So one of the ways that they're able to grow and develop so much is because their bodies have brown fat on them. If you ever see a newborn in the next couple of months, or maybe you know one right now, notice on the back of its neck and the top of its back, it's almost like it has like a scruff, you know, like those little like coyotes and stuff that like bite the necks of their babies and carry around. Like look at the back of the newborn baby and they have this extra layer of fat there, almost so that you, I mean don't pick it up like that, that would be awful, but it's like you almost could because there's this extra fatty layer there. That's all their brown fat. It accumulates in this kind of back area. And it does that so that the newborns have a higher chance of survival in case their mom dies or in case something happens or, you know, all of the things. It's a built-in mechanism to help increase the chance of survival. Obesity obviously results when you have too much adipose tissue. So hypertrophic growth, this is when fatty acids accumulate, right? Those cells just get bigger and bigger and bigger, right? That's what hypertrophy is, right? Cells getting bigger. Hypercellular is when the number of adipocytes increases, which can happen again because of mesenchymal cells, but it stops at some point because the adipocytes themselves can't actually divide, right? Adipocytes lack the ability to create new cells themselves. So obviously obesity comes with its own list of health effects and health problems, and we'll be talking about some of those things kind of as we go throughout this semester, just to bring about healthy awareness. Other specialized connective tissues are things like cartilage, bone, and blood. So just to save space, I'm going to erase some of this. Does anyone want a picture of it before I take it away? Okay. Just so I can fit everything up here. So we're going to talk about cartilage and bone and blood. Cartilage, obviously, this is in between joints on our ears, nose, bone, of course, is making up our bone, and blood has plasma on it. So let's talk about cartilage. So this is going to be specialized. Cartilage. So cartilage is made of chondrocytes. That's the type of cell that is in cartilage, a chondrocyte. And chondrocytes live in a little nest. The nest is called a lacuna. It's like a little cave where this chondrocyte lives. And this cartilage is there for shock absorption, it's there for lubrication, it's there to resist shearing forces and things like that, compression. Cartilage itself is surrounded by something called a perichondrium. A perichondrium is like a little blanket that goes around the cartilage. And you'll see there's a little blanket that goes around your bones, and there's blankets that go around lots of the organs. I just like to think of it like a blanket because it just sounds nice and cozy. But the perichondrium is a way that the nutrients get to the cartilage. This cartilage itself does not have a blood supply. It's avascular. And so the only way those cartilage cells, those chondrocytes, get nutrients is because this perichondrium is in close contact. So let's talk about the types of cartilage. There's hyaline cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the cartilage you probably thought about when I said we're going to talk about cartilage. Hyaline cartilage is the cartilage that surrounds the ends of your long bones. Hyaline cartilage, we'll go back to babies. Hyaline cartilage was the original foundation for your skeleton. When you were developing in utero, before you even had bones, you had a skeleton made of cartilage. It was made of hyaline cartilage that eventually converted to bone over time. So hyaline cartilage is on our bones. It lays the framework for your fetal skeleton. And did it flip backwards? There we go, sorry. So we call it articular cartilage when it's on the ends of our bones. But the matrix of this is mostly ground substance. In other words, not a lot of fibers here. So this is the one that kind of looks like these little cells floating in space. They're just these little bubbles floating in like a purple background. There they are. You can see virtually no fibers there at all. Oh, zoomed in. So you can see the chondrocytes in the lacuna. The chondrocytes are the cells. The lacuna are the nests that the cells are in. All right, fibrocartilage is another one. Fibrocartilage has more fibers in it, hence fibrocartilage, right? Fibrocartilage makes pads. So you have fibrocartilage pads or discs in between your vertebrae. Right, those are made of fibrocartilage. This is collagen and elastic fibers that are within our fibrocartilage. And again, we still have chondrocytes. So this is going to be like on our vertebral discs. On a lecture exam, I'm not going to give you a picture of a tissue and say, which tissue is this, right? That's more for lab. In here, I might ask you, which of the following types of cartilage would you find on the end of a long bone, right? So I would give you a description, or I might say, what is the name of a cartilage cell, right? Things like that would be how I would test you in here.
Is it cartilage cell the chondrocyte?
Do what?
Is the cartilage cell the chondrocyte?
It is, it's a chondrocyte, yeah. Whether it's in hyaline cartilage or fibrocartilage or elastic cartilage, it's always a chondrocyte. Yeah, good question. If there ever are any diagrams or pictures I want you to know for a lecture exam, I'll make sure you know which ones those are so you know which ones to pay attention to. So you can see here much more fibers in this. That background of hyaline was nice and smooth. The background here in fibrocartilage is kind of wavy. So the last type of cartilage is called elastic cartilage. Elastic cartilage is found in our ears. It's very bendy, right? Again, when you think of elastic cartilage, maybe think of elastic fibers and how it springs things back to life. And so think about if you were to squish your ear into a really small piece, your ear kind of boings back and gets back to shape easily because of the elastic fibers that are within the elastic cartilage of your ear. Parts of your larynx, parts of your throat also have elastic cartilage in them to help with that vibration that produces the tonation of your voice. So here you see much more fibers, right? Denser. And the fibers actually look different than they do in fibrocartilage because they're thin elastic fibers. So we move on to bone. Here, we're looking at another specialized connective tissue where the majority of the matrix here is solid. It's calcified collagen and calcium phosphate. So you have collagen as our main fiber and calcium phosphate that has been calcified and hardened, making bone the hardest substance in the body. It undergoes a series of remodeling, and we'll look at that process in the next couple of chapters when we do bones. But basically, it will grow in response to stress. So in other words, if you're putting lots of weight on your bones are going to grow nice and strong and thick. If you're just sitting around and not really exercising, you're not doing anything to put stress on your bones are going to get more brittle and weak. Right? You know this if you've ever paid attention to an old person. Right? As they get older, they become less and less mobile, and therefore they're more apt to break a hip or a hand or whatever because their bones are becoming more brittle because they just sit around because they're not more mobile. And it's kind of this vicious cycle of aging that we'll talk about eventually. But yeah, but that's why. And we'll talk about the different types of cells that do that when we get there. One of the types of cells in bone is called osteoblasts. These are bone builders. They build bone. Right, so they're also surrounded by a periosteum. So in cartilage we had a perichondrium, the cartilage blanket. Well, in bones we have a periosteum, a bone blanket. So everything's surrounded by a periosteum. But unlike cartilage, bone actually does have a blood supply to it, so bone does get nutrients directly from the blood. We'll look at that more when we do our bone chapter. There's also osteocytes and osteoclasts. Osteocytes are mature bone cells. Osteoclasts actually dissolve bone. So they do the opposite of osteoblasts. And again, we'll look at this structure as we go into our bone chapter. Right now we're just brushing the surface of what bones are and how they look and how they work. But it's very similar in structure to our cartilage. Here we had chondrocytes, here we have osteocytes. Those chondrocytes lived in a lacuna. Guess what? So do osteocytes. Osteocytes live in a lacuna as well, a little nest amidst all of the collagen and calcium phosphate. And we have a perichondrium surrounding the cartilage. We have a periosteum surrounding the bone. So lots of similarities there between these two support connective tissues. Finally, we have blood. Blood is another unique tissue. And I'm going to erase this so that I can write about blood up here, although there's not that much to add. We have a whole chapter dedicated to blood next semester in AAP2. But blood, of course, has plasma as our ground substance. There are some fibers in blood, but they're actually dissolved fibers. So imagine that I could pull a fiber out of thin air. It's kind of how your blood works. There's fibers floating around in your blood, but they're dissolved. And when your blood needs fibers for clotting purposes, those fibers can materialize because of the different chemicals and things like that, kind of making them and pulling them out of blood. So in our blood, there's plasma proteins, which those are there. They're not fibers, but plasma proteins will help with things like clotting. They'll also help carry hormones and things like that. Again, whole chapter dedicated to this next semester. But we do have erythrocytes, leukocytes, and platelets, right? Red blood cells, white blood cells, and platelets. I'm just going to abbreviate up here, but you should be familiar with the term erythrocyte and leukocyte. I'm just going to write RBC and WBC just for simplicity up here. Right. So red blood cells specialize in carrying the oxygen. White blood cells are actually part of our immune system, and platelets are going to assist with clotting. So all of these things float around in our blood, doing their job, bringing nutrients, keeping us healthy, etc. We looked at blood last night under the microscope. So let's talk about some disorders and things like this that come about. So osteoarthritis is one thing that comes about from maybe age or trauma brought into our skeletal system. So this actually happens as the hyaline cartilage that's on the end of our bones, that starts deteriorating. And when that starts deteriorating, it's kind of like poking holes in the cartilage. It's just not being maintained. And so the bones will start rubbing against each other. That can be very painful. It can lead to destruction of the bone, which can lead to immobility, right? Immobility then leads to decreased bone mass, which leads to more immobility, and it's this vicious cycle. So chondroblasts use something called glucosamine. A chondroblast is a cartilage building cell that secretes something called glucosamine, and that glucosamine is something that kind of recoats and reestablishes the cartilage in that area. So it's an area of research where doctors and scientists are researching to try to figure out, like, what exactly can we use this for? How can we use this to our advantage to assist people that have osteoarthritis? So it's important to understand that osteoarthritis is not the same as osteoporosis. A lot of students confuse the two. So osteoarthritis, this is man, I'm so old, my knees hurt, you know? Like, oh, did you hear all that cracking sound when I stood up this morning? That was my back, because I'm real old, right? It has to do with your joints, right? Whereas osteoporosis is like the old lady that broke her hip, right? Osteoporosis is thinning bones, right? And we'll look at both of these when we do the skeletal system. This is just an introduction. So this is what normal cartilage should look like, but in the case of osteoarthritic cartilage that's kind of being pockmarked, of course it will not be as smooth. So just like before, we had a nice chart with all of the epithelial tissues. Got a nice chart here of all the connective tissues for you. So if my yapping at you and graphic organizer makes no sense, you have a nice picture of it here. Something that you could do would maybe print this out one slide per page and bend each column over and see if you can fill it in, right? Bend it over, see if you can identify what it is just based on the picture. Then see if you can figure out what the function is. Kind of check yourself this way, as well as the location. You can use the slide as your flashcard. You don't have to recreate the wheel. So, whoops, wrong way. There's another one. Muscle tissues. Another little piece. Again, muscle tissues, kind of like a stepchild in this chapter because we're not quite paying so much attention to it compared to all the connective tissue and epithelial tissue. But muscle tissue is specialized for contraction, right? Connective tissue is there to fill spaces, connect things, transport, right, support, whatever. Epithelial tissue is covering and lining. Muscle tissue is specialized for contraction. So walking, breathing, heart beating, all those things require muscle contractions. Muscle cells are called myocytes. So we were introduced to the term chondrocyte, right? Osteocyte. Here we have a myocyte. That suffix cyte, C-Y-T-E, means cell. Myo literally means muscle. So it's a muscle cell, and they're what we call excitable, right? An excitable cell is one that can do something. Think about a skin cell, right? If you wake up a skin cell, what's it gonna do? It's just gonna sit there, right? But if you wake up a muscle cell, it can contract, it can do something. It's actually excitable, right? So not all cells in our body have that capability to get excited. And this is, of course, in response to some type of chemical stimulus or an electrical stimulus. So our muscle cells are classified a couple of ways. We actually graphed this out and talked about it last night. They can be striated or smooth. So striated just means that they're striped, right? And this gives you patterns of kind of light and dark, and it just has to do with their microscopic structure. Your textbook right now is using a term that's called myofilaments. You can know that if you want, but I'm not going to use that term on your test. I'm not going to ask you about myofilaments until we get to muscle tissue in a couple of chapters. There's enough here without me asking about the word myofilament. So there's stuff inside that makes it striped. For now is all you need to know. So our muscle cells can either be striped or smooth in appearance. And it's all surrounded by something called an endomysium, which is kind of like that perichondrium and periosteum, a nice little blanket that goes around the outside of the cell. So it helps hold everything together. So there's 3 types of muscle tissue. Right, we have skeletal, we have cardiac, and we have smooth. So skeletal and cardiac muscle tissues are both striated, whereas smooth muscle is not. So we can add that here if you want, striated, striated. And you can call smooth muscle smooth, or you can call it non-striated, doesn't matter. As long as you understand the fact that it does not have stripes when you look at it under the microscope. Skeletal muscle is voluntary. You can choose to contract your skeletal muscles. Our skeletal muscle is also multinucleate, which means there are several nuclei in